Hello and welcome to another tier list video. Today we are taking a look at CSGO knives. Now, as I said before in my other CSGO videos, CSGO is probably the game I've put more hours into compared to any other game. I have well over 2,000 hours across all my accounts. And while I don't currently own any knives, I have seen them all many times, and I do have some fairly strong opinions about which ones I like more. I'm going to be just ranking these knives based on looks and their inspect animations. So jumping in, we have the bayonet knife. Honestly, a classic, one of the original knives that were released along with the original set. And honestly, it's a pretty good knife. Visually, I don't think it's super cool, but I really love the animation that it has when you pull out the knife and he does a little like hand flip. I think that looks pretty cool, but outside of that, I don't love the knife. Still pretty good, so it'll find itself up in the B tier. Up next, we have the M9 bayonet. Now, another one pretty similar to the bayonet, but this is more so, I would say, the CT variant of the bayonet version, if the bayonet is the T variant. And honestly, I really like the M9 bayonet. I think it looks visually just much cooler. It's got the serrated edge, which I think looks really clean. And it also has a pretty cool animation when you pull it out as well. But I just think that a lot of different skins look really great on the M9 bayonet. And it's one of my favorite knife skins in the game, so it's going to find itself up in the S tier. Up next, we have the butterfly knife, which just visually, I don't think the butterfly knife really looks that cool. As far as the original knives they released, I would say it's one of my least favorite visually, but the inspect animations and the draw animations for the butterfly knife are some of the coolest. It just looks and sounds so satisfying every time you pull it out, and the inspect animations for the butterfly knife are also really cool as well, so that alone is going to be enough to bring it up into the A tier for me. Up next, we have the Karambit, another absolute classic. Super cool, draw animation, super cool inspect animation, looks cool, a lot of skins look really good on it. It's easily, I would say this is probably my second favorite knife on the list, and for that reason it's going to find itself up in the S tier as well. Up next, we have the Huntsman. It seems like I'm praising all these knives. I'll get to some that I critique a little more, but the Huntsman, honestly, it is my favorite knife on the list. I just think it looks super cool. The blade shape, the serrated back edge, just visually, even the default Huntsman looks super good. And there's a ton of knife skins that just look so clean on the Huntsman. So this is by far, I would say, my favorite knife in the game, and it's going to find itself up in the S tier. Up next, we have the gut knife. Now, I told you I would criticize some knives, and the gut knife is going to be my first one. Visually, I just don't think it looks really that good. It is probably one of my least favorite knives on this list. I don't really like the color of the handle. I prefer, black handles on the knife, and the gut knife, I just really don't like it. Even when it has good skins on it, I'm just never a fan of the gut knife, and honestly, it's going to be an F tier for me. Up next, we have, now, I don't know how to pronounce this actually, the Ursus Knife, the Ursus Knife. No idea what the proper pronunciation is on that. But this knife I'm really not a fan of. I think the shape is a little bit too simple for me. It's, basically a rectangle with like kind of the end cut off to a point. I really don't think it looks that good. There are some skins that can make it, usable, but honestly, really not a fan of this knife at all, and it's going to find itself down in the D tier. Not the worst, but it's pretty bad for my money. Up next, we have the flip knife. This is another pretty classic knife. This is usually one of the cheaper knives I've found, and I think it looks pretty good. The default flip knife, it looks solid. It's not my favorite in the world. It has a decent draw animation. The inspect animation really isn't anything special, but it's okay. It's decent, and for the price, it's going to find itself in the B tier. Up next, we have the Stiletto Knife. Now, this is one of the few knives that I actually think looks best with no skin on it. There are some skins that the Stiletto Knife looks good, but the Stiletto Knife itself, I prefer to have it just no skin. It almost just doesn't even look like a knife. It's more of a, I suppose it's basically what it is a shiv. And I just don't think that a lot of the skins really do it justice, so it's a decent knife, not my favorite, but I really only prefer it with no skin, so it'll find itself in the B tier. Up next, we have the Shadow Daggers. Honestly, the only akimbo knives in the game, and I just really don't think that they look super cool. Their inspect animations are pretty good. Some of the skins can look pretty good, but compared to every other knife, I just don't really love the idea of holding two knives, and some people call them the butt plugs, because the default kind of look like them, but honestly, not my favorite knife. Gonna find themselves in a pretty mediocre D tier. Up next, we have the Bowie Knife. Now, this is another one that I just think looks really good. I love the shape of it. I love the serrated back edge, and there's a lot of different skins on the Bowie Knife that I think look really, really clean. Honestly, another really solid one. I would say for me, this is just below the S tier. I want to put it in the S tier, but for me, the S tier knives are just too good, and Bowie Knife gonna find itself up in the A tier still, though. Up next, we have the Nomad knife. Now, this is another knife that I actually really like the shape of. The blade itself isn't doing anything too crazy, but I really like the handle. It's got pretty good draw animations, pretty good inspect animations. Overall, just a really solid knife. I would say of the recent knives they've released, this is probably my favorite one. Again, not going to be quite up in the S tier with those great knives, but still a very solid A tier. Up next, we have the Falchion knife, which I believe, if I'm correct in this, it was the first knife they released after the initial batch of knives when they first released skins into the game. And I think the Falchion knife looks pretty good. Visually, it's not great. It's got a pretty unique handle, which I like. But the best thing about the Falchion knife is the unique inspect animation. The default inspect animation is pretty good, but it has the rare one, kind of like, you know, a Deagle spin, where he basically balances the knife on his hand. And that looks really cool. Worth getting it enough for that. But Falchion knife, definitely going to be a very solid B tier. Up next, we have the, again, I don't know how to pronounce this one, Navajo, the Navajo knife, Navajo knife, I have no idea. You guys can correct me how to properly pronounce it, but I really do not like this knife. The blade is okay, but it's just too short of a blade for me. The handle is pretty ugly. I really don't like this knife at all. The inspect animation is okay, but visually, I just don't find it appealing at all, so it's going to find itself down in the D tier. Up next, we have the Survival Knife. Now, for me, this is kind of like an uglier Huntsman knife. You know, you got a lot of different things going on with the knife, similar to like you do to the Huntsman. The handle is okay, but the blade itself, there's just too many different things going on. I mean, I get it's supposed to be a survival knife, but honestly, not a huge fan of it. It's not terrible, but for me, it's kind of a low-budget Huntsman for my money, so it's going to find itself down in the C tier. Up next, we have the Paracord knife. Honestly, I didn't really like this knife the first time I saw it, but when I saw a few different skins with the Paracord knife, I actually think it looks pretty good. I think if you have the right skin on the Paracord knife, it's pretty good. It's got a decent inspect animation, a decent draw animation, so Paracord knife gonna find itself in a respectable B tier. Now, if the Survival knife is the low-budget Huntsman, I would say the Talon knife is the middle-tier budget Karambit. It still looks pretty good. I mean, even the inspect animation is like kind of similar to the Karambit. Of course, you have the hole for your finger or your thumb for the knife. I think it looks okay. For me, I think the Karambit's curvature looks really good, and I don't think a serrated edge on a curved knife really looks that great, so I'm not a huge fan of the knife. Again, it looks okay, but like I said before, I don't really love handles that aren't black. I think black handles on knives always look the best. So the Talon knife, it's not bad, but it's also going to find itself in a C tier. Up next, we have the CSGO, I guess Counter-Strike Source knife, that is. And a lot of people have a lot of nostalgia for this one. I have a bit of nostalgia myself because Counter-Strike Source is the Counter-Strike that I put in, you know, I would say 500 hours before CSGO came out. So I played the game a lot, very familiar with the knife. And the nostalgia factor is there, but visually, I don't think it looks that cool. I mean, a lot of people like having this knife because they love Counter-Strike Source. I love Counter-Strike Source, but I think compared to some of the other knives, it's just not quite as cool. It's still good, and it really does look good with certain skins on it, so it'll find itself in a C tier, but again, the nostalgia factor doesn't really weigh too much into my opinion on this one. Last but not least, we have the Skeleton Knife. Now, this is another knife that I actually really like. I think the design is very unique. It's got a nice point. It's got the hole in the middle. Both the draw animation and the inspect animation is really good. Honestly, just overall a very solid knife, and Skeleton gonna find himself up in the A tier. Well, that's my list. Hope you guys enjoyed, and let me know your thoughts.